Train engineer panicked as freight train lost control. Then the old veteran took over. "Get that old man away from my controls!" screamed the young train engineer as his 8,000-ton freight train barreled toward the city at 70 miles per hour with failed brakes. Thomas Rodriguez, barely 26 and fresh out of training, was losing control of 120 cars loaded with hazardous chemicals. But the 78-year-old man quietly standing behind him wasn't just a curious passenger. He was Samuel "Sam" Hayes, a Korean War veteran who had spent 45 years running military supply trains through enemy territory. What happened in the next 12 minutes would save thousands of lives and teach everyone aboard the difference between panic and experience. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Norfolk Southern rail yard in Atlanta as the massive freight train prepared for its 400-mile journey to Jacksonville. Engine 7823, a 4,400-horsepower diesel locomotive, sat at the head of a consist that stretched nearly 2 miles behind it. The cargo manifest told a sobering story. Tank cars filled with industrial chemicals, flatbeds loaded with military vehicles bound for Fort Stewart, and grain hoppers that could feed a small city. Thomas Rodriguez climbed into the engineer's cab with the nervous energy of someone still proving himself. At 26, he had been a qualified engineer for only 8 months, and this was his first solo run on such a heavy consist. His conductor, Mike Chen, was equally young at 29, and both men carried the weight of responsibility that comes with moving 8,000 tons of cargo through populated areas. Rodriguez had studied every manual, passed every test, and completed all required training. But book learning and real-world experience are different things, and the veterans who worked the yard had noticed his tendency to rely heavily on computer systems and automatic controls. "Kid's got the knowledge," one retired engineer had commented, "but he hasn't learned to feel the train yet." The third person in the cab was unexpected. Samuel Hayes had boarded at the last minute with proper authorization from the railroad's management, though his presence puzzled the young crew. At 78, he moved slowly and carefully, wearing simple work clothes that had seen better decades. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his hands marked by a lifetime of manual labor, and his eyes held the particular alertness of someone who had learned to watch for danger. "Mr. Hayes?" Rodriguez had asked when the old man climbed aboard. "Are you with railroad management?" Hayes had settled into the jump seat with a slight smile. "Not exactly, son. I'm just along for the ride." Rodriguez assumed he was some kind of inspector or retired employee taking a sentimental journey. It never occurred to him to ask about Hayes's background or why railroad management would authorize a civilian to ride in an active locomotive cab. The first 200 miles passed without incident. Rodriguez handled the locomotive competently, following all procedures and maintaining proper speed through each territory. Hayes remained silent in his corner, occasionally looking out the windows, but mostly just watching the younger men work. Chen made radio calls to dispatchers, monitored crossing signals, and maintained the required paperwork. But as they approached the outskirts of Atlanta, traveling through increasingly populated areas, Hayes began to pay closer attention to the train's behavior. His experienced ear picked up subtle changes in the engine's rhythm, slight variations in the wheel-rail interaction that the computer systems weren't designed to detect. Something wasn't quite right. At milepost 327, Rodriguez attempted to begin the gradual speed reduction required for the approach to Atlanta's industrial district. He moved the brake handle to the first position, expecting to feel the familiar response of the air brake system engaging throughout the consist. Instead, nothing happened. The train continued at 70 miles per hour, as if he hadn't touched the controls at all. "That's weird," Rodriguez muttered, trying the brake again. Still no response. He checked his brake pressure gauges. They showed normal system pressure, but the train wasn't slowing. "Mike, I'm not getting any brake response," he called to his conductor. Chen immediately began checking backup systems and emergency procedures, but the computer diagnostics showed all systems normal. Hayes stood up from his jump seat, moving closer to the control console. "What kind of brake problem are you having, son?" he asked quietly. Rodriguez, now sweating despite the air conditioning, explained that the brakes weren't responding to commands. "All the gauges show normal pressure, but we're not slowing down." "Have you tried the independent brake?" Hayes suggested. Rodriguez nodded. He'd already attempted to use the locomotive's independent brake system, but it too was unresponsive. The train continued thundering toward Atlanta at highway speed, and Rodriguez was beginning to panic as he realized the magnitude of his situation. "We need to notify dispatch immediately," Chen said, reaching for the radio. But Hayes held up a hand. "Before you declare an emergency, let me take a look at something." He moved to the brake controls and examined them with the practiced eye of someone who had seen this before. "Son, when did you last have a full brake test on this consist?" Rodriguez checked his paperwork. "This morning, before departure, all cars tested good." But Hayes was looking at something that wasn't in any computer manual. He studied the air pressure readings, the brake pipe configuration, and the consist composition with an analytical approach that came from decades of experience. "You've got a classic brake pipe separation," Hayes announced after a few minutes of observation. "Probably around car 85 or 90. The front portion of your train is getting brake commands, but they're not reaching the rear cars. The computer thinks everything's normal because it's only monitoring the front portion of the system." Rodriguez stared at him. "How could you know that?" "The diagnostics don't show any separation." Hayes pointed to a pressure gauge that Rodriguez had been monitoring, but not truly understanding. "This gauge shows your brake pipe pressure, but look at the fluctuation pattern. It's staying too steady. If you had full connectivity, you'd see more variation as the system cycled." Chen was already on the radio to dispatch, reporting their brake problem and requesting instructions. But as they crested a hill and could see the lights of Atlanta sprawling before them, Hayes knew they didn't have time for standard procedures. "How much do you know about dynamic braking, son?" he asked Rodriguez. "I know the basics," Rodriguez replied, his voice tight with stress. "But in training, they told us never to rely on it for primary braking, especially with a heavy consist." Hayes nodded. "That's good advice under normal circumstances. But these aren't normal circumstances." The radio crackled with dispatch instructions. 7823, you are authorized to dump your air and make an emergency brake application." Rodriguez reached for the emergency brake, but Hayes caught his arm. "Son, if you dump the air on a separated consist, you're going to have a massive derailment. The front cars will stop, but the rear cars will keep pushing and pile up behind them. If you're enjoying this incredible story of how railroad experience saved thousands of lives when modern technology failed, make sure to subscribe for more amazing veteran stories like this one." Hayes continued. "What you need to do is use dynamic braking to slow the front portion, while gradually bleeding off air pressure to ease the rear cars into a controlled stop." Rodriguez looked at him with a mixture of desperation and hope. "Can you show me how?" Hayes moved to the controls with fluid efficiency despite his age. His hands found switches and levers that Rodriguez had learned about in training, but never used in a real emergency. "First, we set up maximum dynamic braking on the locomotive." This will slow us down without affecting the separated portion of the consist. The locomotive's traction motors immediately began working as generators, converting the train's momentum into electrical energy and dissipating it as heat. Rodriguez could feel the difference immediately. The massive locomotive began to fight against its own forward momentum. But they were still traveling at dangerous speed toward populated areas. Now comes the tricky part, Hayes explained, his voice calm despite the crisis. We need to gradually reduce air pressure in the brake pipe. Not dump it, just reduce it slowly. This will cause the rear cars to start braking gently without jackknifing the consist. His hands moved over controls that Rodriguez had never seen used in combination. Hayes began manually controlling air pressure with a technique that wasn't taught in modern training programs. It required understanding not just the mechanics of the brake system, but the physics of how 120 cars react to different braking forces. Rodriguez watched in amazement as the old man orchestrated a delicate ballet of locomotive dynamics, air pressure management, and train handling. "How do you know all this?" Rodriguez asked, as he felt the train finally beginning to respond. Hayes glanced at him with eyes that held memories of much more dangerous situations. 45 years of running trains, son. 30 of those in places where if you made a mistake, people died. The train was slowing now, but they were still approaching Atlanta too fast for safety. Hayes continued his careful manipulation of the controls, using techniques that combined old-school train handling with an intuitive understanding of heavy rail dynamics. Rodriguez realized he was witnessing a masterclass in railroad operations from someone who had learned his skills in an era when computerized systems didn't exist to catch human errors. "Mr. Hayes," Chen called out, "dispatch is asking for our estimated stopping distance." Hayes looked at the speedometer, calculated their deceleration rate in his head, and factored in the grade changes ahead. "Tell them we'll have full control in about 8 miles, well before we reach any populated areas." Rodriguez couldn't believe what he was hearing. "How can you be so sure?" Hayes smiled for the first time since the crisis began. "Son, I ran supply trains through North Korea in 1951. We had locomotives that were held together with wire and prayer, tracks that had been bombed 3 times a week, and brake systems that hadn't been properly maintained in years. If you couldn't figure out how to stop a train under impossible conditions, supply lines failed and soldiers died." The revelation hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. The quiet old man he had assumed was just a railroad retiree taking a sentimental ride was a Korean War veteran who had kept military supply lines running under combat conditions. Hayes continued working the controls with the confidence of someone who had faced much worse situations and survived. As they finally brought the massive freight train to a controlled stop just outside Atlanta's city limits, Rodriguez realized he had just received the most valuable education of his railroad career. Hayes had not only prevented a catastrophic derailment, but had taught him train handling techniques that no simulator could replicate. "Mr. Hayes," Rodriguez said as emergency crews surrounded their locomotive, "I need to know, who are you really?" Hayes was gathering his simple jacket and preparing to leave the cab. "I'm exactly who I said I was, son. Just a man along for the ride." But Chen had been thinking about Hayes's casual mention of Korea and military supply trains. "Sir, were you with the Military Railroad Service?" Hayes paused at the cab door. "United States Army Transportation Corps, 724th Railway Operating Battalion. We kept the supplies moving from Busan to Seoul when everyone said it couldn't be done." The full scope of what had just happened began to dawn on both young men. They had been in the presence of a veteran of one of the most challenging railroad operations in military history. The Korean War Railroad Service had operated under constant enemy fire, with equipment that was often damaged, through territory that was frequently contested. Hayes had learned train handling under conditions that made their current emergency seem routine. "How many trains did you run in Korea?" Rodriguez asked, now understanding that he was speaking to a living piece of railroad history. "Lost count after the first year," Hayes replied. "But every one of them carried ammunition, food, or medical supplies that soldiers needed to stay alive. You learn real quick that there's no such thing as impossible when lives depend on getting through." Word of the emergency stop and Hayes's intervention spread quickly through the railroad's communication network. Within hours, senior management from Norfolk Southern arrived at the scene to understand exactly what had happened. They found Hayes calmly drinking coffee with the emergency crew, answering questions about the brake pipe separation he had diagnosed and the unconventional but effective stopping technique he had employed. Railroad Superintendent Margaret Wilson, a 25-year veteran of railroad operations, interviewed Hayes about his background and his actions during the emergency. "Mr. Hayes, our computer models suggest that what you did shouldn't have worked. The dynamic braking loads combined with selective air pressure reduction should have caused wheel slip and potential derailment." Hayes smiled patiently. "Ma'am, computers are wonderful tools, but they can only model situations they've been programmed to understand. In Korea, we didn't have computers. We had trains that needed to run regardless of conditions, and we learned by doing." He gestured toward Rodriguez and Chen. "These young men know their systems perfectly, but they've never had to improvise when the systems fail." Wilson realized she was talking to someone whose experience predated modern railroad technology by decades. "Would you be willing to share some of that experience with our training department?" Hayes considered the question seriously. "I suppose that depends on whether they're interested in learning techniques that aren't in the manual." The investigation into the brake pipe separation revealed exactly what Hayes had diagnosed. A failed coupling between cars 87 and 88 had severed the airline while maintaining the electrical connections that fed information to the locomotive's computer systems. The separation had been invisible to all electronic monitoring systems, but Hayes had identified it through subtle pressure variations that only decades of experience could interpret. Rodriguez and Chen were both commended for their handling of the emergency, but they insisted that Hayes receive the primary recognition. "Without him, we would have either derailed the train or crashed into Atlanta at high speed," Rodriguez told investigators. "He didn't just save our cargo, he saved thousands of lives in the city." Hayes declined most offers of recognition, but he did agree to work with Norfolk Southern's training department to develop new curriculum based on old-school railroad techniques. "Young engineers today are very good at running trains when everything works perfectly," he explained to the training staff. "But they need to learn what to do when the perfect systems fail." The program Hayes developed became known unofficially as Crisis Railroad Operations, though the official title was more bureaucratic. It combined modern technology with traditional train handling techniques, teaching engineers to understand their trains as mechanical systems rather than just computer-controlled equipment. Hayes insisted that every student spend time learning to feel their train through vibrations, sounds, and pressure variations. Rodriguez became Hayes's most dedicated student, requesting assignment to every training session Hayes conducted. "He taught me more about railroading in one emergency than I learned in 2 years of formal training," Rodriguez would later tell other young engineers. "Computers can tell you what's happening, but experience teaches you what to do about it." The freight industry took notice of Hayes's techniques, and he began receiving invitations to speak at railroad conferences and training seminars. His presentation, titled "When the Systems Fail, Old School Solutions for Modern Problems," became one of the most requested topics in railroad professional development. But Hayes remained humble about his role, always emphasizing that his techniques were products of necessity rather than innovation. "We did what we had to do to get the job done," he would tell audiences. "The only difference between then and now is that today's engineers have better tools when everything works right. But when things go wrong, the principles haven't changed." 5 years after the Atlanta incident, Rodriguez was promoted to Chief Engineer Trainer for Norfolk Southern's Southeastern Division. His training program incorporated Hayes's techniques as standard curriculum, and every new engineer learned both computer-based operations and traditional train handling methods. "The goal is to create engineers who can think like Mr. Hayes," Rodriguez explained to his classes. Hayes continued to live quietly in his small house near the rail yard, but his phone rang regularly with calls from railroads across the country facing unusual problems. He never refused a request for help, understanding that his knowledge represented a bridge between the railroad industry's practical past and its technological future. Today, there's a small plaque in Norfolk Southern's Atlanta terminal, placed there by the crew members who learned the most important lesson of their railroad careers from an elderly man they had almost overlooked. It reads, "In honor of Samuel Hayes, Korean War veteran, who taught us that the best technology works best when guided by experience and wisdom." The lesson of that day continues to influence railroad operations across the country, reminding engineers that behind every computer system and automated control, there must be a human being who understands not just how the machine is supposed to work, but how to make it work when everything goes wrong. Samuel Hayes provided that understanding when it mattered most, proving that some knowledge can only be earned through decades of real-world experience in the most challenging conditions imaginable.